By August 1945, Japan wasn't just weakening, it was collapsing from within. Cities burned, undefended, fuel reserves vanished, and millions starved as the blockade tightened. The Air Force hoarded thousands of planes, yet couldn't fly them. Radar networks left the homeland virtually blind. A secret mining operation strangled the nation. What made their final defensive plan completely obsolete? The sky belonged to America. The first critical weakness? Japan had lost control of its own skies. By July 1945, the Japanese air forces were destroyed, not just damaged, completely unable to defend the homeland. American B-29 bombers flew overhead during daylight. They faced almost no resistance. Experienced pilots were gone. Training programs had stopped. Here's what's shocking. Japan still had aircraft, thousands of them actually. But here's the problem, and this connects to our first mystery about hoarded planes. These aircraft sat on the ground, hidden in forests and dispersed airfields. They were being saved for one final desperate plan called Ketsugo, a last-stand defense. But saving planes for later doesn't work if you can't use them now. And they couldn't. Enemy bombers ruled the skies with complete freedom. High altitude, low altitude, it didn't matter. But why couldn't Japan fly those thousands of hidden aircraft? The answer reveals an even deeper problem: the fuel that wasn't there. Now we answer that first mystery. Why did Japan hoard planes it couldn't fly? The answer is simple, but devastating. No fuel. Japan produced almost no oil domestically. Before the conflict, they imported everything from the Dutch East Indies, from captured territories. By mid-1945, those supply lines were completely severed. The stockpiles? Empty. Pilots couldn't train. Even basic flight practice stopped. The reserve aircraft, of those thousands waiting for Ketsugo, were essentially decorations, metal birds that would never fly. Aviation fuel reserves had dropped to nearly zero. This wasn't just an inconvenience. This was total paralysis. Imagine preparing for the biggest defensive battle in your nation's history, and your Air Force is grounded. Not because of combat losses, because there's nothing to put in the tanks. But fuel wasn't the only resource disappearing. Something else was being secretly cut off, and it affected everything. The invisible stranglehold. Remember that secret mining operation we mentioned? Here's what it was. American submarines and aircraft began dropping thousands of mines in Japanese waters. The operation had a name, Operation Starvation, and it worked exactly as planned. Japan is an island nation. Everything comes by ship. Raw materials, food, coal, iron ore, all of it travels by sea. By August 1945, over 90% of imports had stopped. Not slowed down, stopped. The merchant fleet was destroyed or trapped in harbors too afraid to move. Ships that tried to sail hit mines and sank. The few that remained couldn't risk leaving port. This created a cascading collapse. Factories needed raw materials they couldn't get. Citizens needed food that couldn't arrive. The industrial machine ground to a halt. The mining operation didn't just hurt Japan's military, it choked the entire nation. And without resources flowing in, Japan's industries began shutting down one by one. Factories falling silent. With no materials coming in, Japan's war production collapsed. Before the blockade, factories built aircraft, ships, weapons, ammunition. By summer 1945, production had nearly stopped. Aircraft engine plants were bombed, steel facilities were destroyed. The factories that survived couldn't operate without raw materials. Japan tried dispersing industry, moving production to smaller, hidden facilities, but it was too late and too disorganized. Key manufacturing centers were identified and targeted. The Nakajima aircraft plant, for example, was hit repeatedly until it became unusable. Here's the problem. You can't fight a modern conflict without industry. No new planes, no replacement parts, no ammunition being manufactured. The military was using up supplies with no way to replace them. Every day the arsenal shrank. Every bomb dropped, every bullet fired, gone forever. But even if they could build weapons, there was another problem. They couldn't see the enemy coming, blind to the threat. This brings us to that second mystery. How were Japan's radar networks leaving them blind? The technology existed, Japan had radar stations, but compared to American and British systems, they were primitive. Coverage was spotty, unreliable. The network couldn't provide effective early warning for high-altitude bomber formations. When B-29s approached at 30,000 feet, radar often failed to detect them in time. And nighttime low-level attacks, even worse. The homeland was essentially defenseless against surprise raids. Cities couldn't prepare. Air raid sirens came too late or not at all. By the time people heard the bombers, it was already over. This blindness made every other weakness worse. Without warning, you can't scramble planes. Not that they had fuel anyway. You can't evacuate civilians effectively. You're simply reacting to destruction after it happens. And what the radar couldn't see was about to become Japan's worst nightmare. Cities built to burn. Japanese cities had a fatal vulnerability. They were constructed primarily of wood and paper. Traditional architecture used these materials for centuries, beautiful, practical for earthquakes, but defensively catastrophic. When American forces shifted strategy to incendiary attacks, the results were devastating. Fire spread through neighborhoods in minutes. Water supplies couldn't keep up. Fire breaks didn't exist in dense urban areas. Civil defense measures were inadequate for this scale of destruction. The attack on Tokyo in March demonstrated this vulnerability horrifically. Approximately 100,000 people perished in a single night, not from explosives, from fire. The city burned so hot that water in canals boiled. This happened again and again, city after city, and there was no defense against it. The wooden construction that had served for generations became a fatal weakness in modern aerial conflict. With cities vulnerable and skies undefended, you'd expect the Navy to protect the homeland. But that force had vanished too. The Navy that disappeared. The Imperial Japanese Navy was once among the world's most powerful. By August 1945, it effectively no longer existed as a fighting force. Major warships had been sunk. Those remaining were trapped at anchor, unable to operate. Without fuel, without supplies, without air cover, the fleet couldn't sail. Some capital ships were destroyed right in their harbors at Kure. This meant Japan couldn't contest American naval movements, couldn't protect any remaining supply lines, couldn't prevent an invasion fleet from approaching. The seas around Japan belonged entirely to Allied forces. Millions of Japanese troops remained stationed overseas in China, Southeast Asia, Pacific Islands. They were completely cut off. Unable to return home, unable to reinforce the homeland defense, strategically useless. Japan was now defending only its own coastline. The empire had shrunk to the home islands themselves, surrounded by enemy-controlled waters. But even with all these military failures, the most desperate crisis was happening to ordinary people.
The hunger, a catastrophic food shortage gripped Japan by summer 1945. The blockade had stopped rice imports from Korea and Southeast Asia. Domestic production collapsed. Farmers were mobilized for military service, leaving fields untended. Fertilizer production had stopped. No raw materials, no functioning factories. The 1945 harvest was disastrous. Food rations were cut again and again. Citizens were facing genuine starvation. This wasn't a military problem that tactics could solve. This was an existential threat to the civilian population. You can ask people to endure military defeats. You can inspire them to keep fighting despite losses. But you cannot fight when there's no food. When families are starving, morale doesn't just drop, it disappears. The nation was being hollowed out from within, not just militarily, but societally. And facing all these crises, Japan's leadership made one final fatal miscalculation. The plan that failed before it began. So what made Japan's final defensive plan completely obsolete? The military leadership developed Ketsugo, the decisive battle plan. They would wait for American forces to invade the beaches of Kyushu, then throw everything into one massive final defense. The goal wasn't victory. It was inflicting enough casualties to negotiate better surrender terms. But this plan assumed invasion was necessary. It assumed armies landing on beaches, soldiers fighting soldiers, traditional conflict. The atomic weapons changed everything. Cities could be destroyed from the air without any invasion. No beaches to defend, no decisive battle to inflict casualties, just instant total destruction. When Hiroshima and Nagasaki were destroyed in seconds, Japan's leadership realized the horrifying truth. Their entire strategy was irrelevant. There would be no glorious last stand, just city after city erased from existence. The bombs weren't dropped on a strong nation. They were the final demonstration to a collapsing system that even desperate resistance was now pointless. The weakest point? Everything. So there you have it, the complete picture of how Japan's home island stood defenseless in those final days. From absent fighters over Hiroshima to overwhelmed anti-aircraft guns, from B-29 raids exposing fatal vulnerabilities to Operation Ketsugo's impossible assumptions. The invasion preparations couldn't address the real problem, systematic collapse at every level. Understanding these interconnected failures shows us why August 1945 unfolded as it did. History isn't about single moments, it's about cascading weaknesses that make those moments inevitable. If this fascinated you, there's more untold history waiting. Until next time.